Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if China collapsed. When speaking of China, I mean the People's Republic of China, or mainland China. As we all know, China is a massive country, and by that I just not only mean population-wise or by the size of it, but also because it's very homogeneous. So this means if we compare it to a country like India, for instance, China has the edge over India because India is very heterogeneous, whereas China has a very similar population, the Han Chinese. It is generally accepted that the Chinese civilization started during two periods, the Xia period and the Shang periods. The Xia era started at around 2100 BC, whereas it ended on 1600 BC. And then we have the Shang era, which started around the end of the Xi era, and then it ended around 1046 in BC, of course. The Chinese identify the Yellow River as the origins of their culture, and the color yellow is still considered as the Chinese color par excellence. It is seen as the color of China's ancient origins as well, and the dragon. China has had a history of frequent collapses and again reunifications. It was big, or even bigger than Rome, but lacked the infrastructure that Rome had. As a result, when a dynasty or ruler became too weak, or certain factions became too strong, China collapsed. Many famous periods like that were the Warring States period, or for instance 475 until 221 BC, the Three Kingdoms period. Then we also have the 16 Kingdoms period, the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms periods, and the most recent example, the Chinese Civil War, which technically never ended. By looking at China's history, it is understandable why a regime wants to have a stable country and to stabilize it at any cost, even at the expense of liberties. The geography in that region is very favorable, and only some civilizations were really able to subjugate the Chinese or even conquer, but only for a short time. A problem we have nowadays with the People's Republic of China has mostly to do with the expansionist agenda. China is now transitioning from an industrial society to a consumerist society, and thus needs resources. It needs food, it needs to trade, it needs to have land, hence the Belt and Road Initiative. But what if all of that changed? What if China collapsed? The point of divergence I propose is the Tiananmen Square protest of 1989. The crackdown on the protest would be more brutal and would trigger widespread unrest. This would be bad for the CCP because North Korea wouldn't really be able to help. The USSR had their own problems, and anyways they were not really considered an ally. And the neighbors, they would be really happy to see China collapsing because nobody of their neighbors likes to see a strong China. The first reaction would come obviously from the West. We would see reactions from the UK, from the US, and maybe also Portugal, who would send more troops either in the military bases, Hong Kong, Macau, or even in the Chinese Sea, for instance. Taiwan would also stay on alert and wait for an opportunity to do something meaningful. Here is where I would split the scenario into. The first part of the scenario is very obvious. The unrest gets more and more bloody, and just after a few days we get an open civil war. The CCP would fight against different factions, and maybe it would also split in itself. Some political factions, some nationalist factions that want independence, and some factions supported by the West. West Turkestan and parts of Tibet will fall immediately out of control, and basically we get a reloaded version of the Chinese Civil War. Maybe also a continuation of it, because Taiwan would also be part of it, and hence why we would get a continuation of the Civil War. Taiwan would then decide to send mercenaries from their alliances, or maybe they would send their own soldiers in some parts. They would form an alliance with different factions. The CCP would then accuse the West of meddling into Chinese affairs, and perhaps North Korea could at a certain moment even send also support, but well, this is not sure. And I also think that Mongolia, for instance, wouldn't really make anything. The only thing that North Korea could also do would be to turn them more towards the West out of fear that they would then be conquered or whatever. But I think also this would be the last hour of Korea. Imagine a civil war-like situation as in Libya or Afghanistan, but worse. All of it happening in China, China becoming a huge mess. And oh boy, I can tell you that we will get many problems in such a world. We would have massive waves of refugees. It would overwhelm the neighboring countries, and these neighboring countries wouldn't even be rich enough to have certain infrastructures to take all these refugees. Even Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, who would be considered rich, would have many problems. And I also don't really think that the Japanese and South Koreans would happily take Chinese refugees, even if they were forced to do so, because South Korea and Japan have very different views to this as the West, for instance, for many good reasons. I cannot really predict what would happen in such an open, bloody and long civil war. I can only just think that this type of civil war would be the worst that the world would have seen, and maybe even more people would die in there than in World War II. Now let's go to part 2. The unrest, they get more and more bloody, but not after a few days. No, it would be a progress, after months, after years. The West would carefully watch what would be happening, and after days, weeks and months of unrest and fear to lose over China, the CCP would try to make reforms, but by then it would already be too late. Because remember, also for instance, someone like Ceausescu in Romania, he then promised to give higher pensions, he promised so many things, but just after he heard the shots in the crowds, yeah. So you can understand why it would be too late. Taiwan under President Lee would work with the West, and several plans and ideas would be made behind closed doors, because no, the public shouldn't know about this. Taiwan or the West should be seen as invaders, but as a force that comes to liberate the people. Speaking of which, several minorities, the Dalai Lama, refugees and anti-communist Chinese voices would be spread throughout Western media, and there would also not be any counter-narrative to this. This is before the internet became widespread, and there would be no ally to the CCP in the world. The US would also work with several countries around the world to push the People's Republic of China perhaps even out from the UN Security Council, and to replace it with not Taiwan, but the Republic of China. Why am I making this difference? Well, they would then claim that Taiwan is not an independent nation, but that the true government of China sits in Taiwan, and it would be the Republic of China. The CCP would fail to liberalize China successfully, and instead of getting the people's support, people would just demand more freedoms, to which the CCP could not respond, and eventually they would flip-flop between giving more liberties and then doing again some crackdowns and having an iron fist. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the independence of several Soviet republics, the CCP would stop giving more liberties, because they would now really fear for their position, and also exchange several officials, also lose certain communist members. We may see a split, and a more iron fist approach would be made. In such a moment, the West could then decide to intervene and strike while the iron was hot. claiming how the CCP attacked Hong Kong, Macau, or the Republic of China. Taiwan would not be able to take all of China, of course, because, well, it's Taiwan, but many zones could be freed up because already in the 90s the Taiwanese army was considerably better equipped than the People's Army or the People's Liberation Army or the Chinese army. The UN would not officially support all of that, but they could tolerate it, and nobody would be in the position to veto an intervention in China. We could also see the Brits coming, giving some assistance, eventually even the Portuguese, but I think the Portuguese, they would be a little bit more careful in that situation. The situation in China would be more complicated. The southern parts may become pacified and under the rule of the Republic of China and local collaborators who would identify with the ideas of the Republic of China. But the Communist Party would have their strongholds as well. They would not just suddenly lose. No, they would fight. Another important aspect is whether the Republic of China elite would accept the independence of Tibet or West Turkestan, but I suspect that someone like Li, who in OTL was willing to push for democratic reforms within Taiwan, would also be able to accept the independence of said countries. Certain supporters, factions and whatnot would not like it, but hey, there's a civil war going on, so nobody would care about West Turkestan or Tibet. Manchuria wouldn't get independence, no, because at this point Manchuria would be so much Chinese and have an overwhelming majority of Han Chinese that independence in there would be deemed ridiculous. Once the Communist Party has less and less resources supplies, which would happen at one point, most of the People's Liberation Army generals would defect to the other side. The West, the Republic of China and local collaborators would promise them amnesty. We could see something similar like in South Africa, where a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would be established. And I think that considering how the Chinese philosophy is, this may be something that could actually happen. You have to understand that all of this would probably take a few years and go on until the 2000s, until all of China would be liberated from the Communist Party. Local elections would be held, Hong Kong and Macau would remain for more years in the hands of Portugal and the UK, Taiwan would start to feel neglected, the world economy would be disrupted, or find a replacement in Vietnam, India or some African countries, and overall the 90s and the 2000s would be more bloody, not to mention the terrorist attacks, of course. New states like Tibet and West Turkestan would be recognized, while other minorities may gain some rights. North Korea may fall earlier, but this is not clear, while South Korea and Japan would get more American troops until the Americans would then go back home. While democratic in name, this new Republic of China would still be somewhat authoritarian and have an interpretation of democracy as in Russia, for instance, or even Ethiopia. A new elite would rule over the people. Former state companies would be privatized in an inefficient manner, and there would be a struggle between the rulers from Taiwan and this new elite and local collaborators and new rich people. Problems would thus continue to rise, and the future of this new Republic of China would be uncertain, still having certain communist guerrilla troops in faraway regions and not having digested the loss of Tibet and West Turkestan. And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.